This is the Everyday Fray podcast, hosted by Michael Howie.
Hello, friend. I'm Michael Howie, and this is episode 4 of the Everyday Fray podcast. Feeling burned out is pretty common. You might have a few days at the office that lasted a little too long. Maybe you're not sleeping that great, and all of a sudden, you've got nothing left in the tank. After a day or two off, you'll feel rested and ready to get back into it. Unless you don't. Experiencing burnout or compassion fatigue isn't something that can always be resolved that easily, and it can very much consume you. For me, in the world of animal advocacy, it's a topic we discuss frequently, and particularly in wildlife rehabilitation or pet rescue, good people are lost to burnout regularly. I know for people in high-stress industries like healthcare, police or military, or education, burning out is also a very real, everyday risk. But anyone can experience the symptoms of burnout. And anyone can combat that burnout with balance in their life. I was thrilled to be able to include Kate Howie, my wife, in this week's podcast. Burnout and compassion fatigue are topics Kate and I discuss regularly, and she's given seminars on the subject that were a big help to a lot of people. That, plus her background in the field of healthcare, specifically mental health and addiction, made her the ideal interview on this subject. To discuss how to identify burnout, what tools we can use to combat it, and how we can ask for help without fear, Kate joined the Everyday Fray. Please note that this interview and contents at everydayfraypodcast.com cannot replace the advice of a medical professional. If you're experiencing suicidal thoughts or have concerns about your safety, please contact the local helpline, doctor, or emergency room immediately. We're going to start out with you sharing who you are and what you do and why this is a subject that you can provide some insight on.
Okay. Well, I am a social worker by background. I went to McMaster University, did the Bachelor of Social Work and Sociology. So I have been a practitioner in the field of addiction since, I believe, actually 2004. So going on 13 years. So that's with a couple different agencies and a couple different age groups. And so I'm now focusing on the senior population. But having been part of the field where it is all about, sort of hearing sad stories and helping people to either change behavior or to improve their lives, you do talk quite a bit about compassion fatigue and about, how it is difficult to hear all of these things all the time. And so I feel that I've learned a few things along the way that I think are helpful to others, hopefully.
Well, and how do we define burnout or compassion fatigue as it's known in our circles?
Well, I think compassion fatigue is really sort of characterized by simply being sort of tired for a long period of time. Feeling, you start to almost feel a bit of resentment. You can start to feel sort of desperate and upset more often than, because we do, as I said, we hear lots of sad stories, but you start to it goes to the next level, right? It starts to really sort of grate on your inner being. And you start to sort of avoid, right? You avoid doing the work, you avoid, having to deal with the emotions. You might, start partaking in compensatory behaviors. Those sorts of things. So it can be very individual as well. I think compassion fatigue or burnout looks different in different people, depending on their experience, their personality, all that kind of stuff.
And what do you mean by compensatory behaviors?
Like we talk about self-medication with, either alcohol, maybe cigarettes, things that are generally unhealthy. It could be even just, avoidance. So, all of your energy is spent at either work or at the places where you volunteer. So you just don't have any energy to interact with your loved ones. So you avoid, you start to isolate, those sorts of things. So compensatory behaviors are just sort of looking for something to kind of take the edge off. something to, to make you feel better, but that isn't necessarily the healthiest option.
And something that I wonder about is trying to identify, are we talking about burnout, or are we talking maybe about someone who's tired, sad, or even, at that point of being actually depressed? How do we differentiate between these various possible syndromes or diagnoses?
Well, I think it's a good question because they can often mimic each other, right? So you can often have symptoms of depression when you're experiencing burnout. You can feel burnt out when you're experiencing depression, right? So it's something that I think really, when you're wondering, is this just, am I getting burnt out? Do I need to address this from a behavioral stance, or is it something that is, just going on sort of in the chemistry of my brain, right? And that would need sort of medical assistance. So that's where I think, using the support of your doctor, maybe seeing a counselor to kind of hash this stuff out, if this is what I'm experiencing, what do you think? And trying to get sort of another opinion, a second opinion, I guess, in terms of, is this depression? And should I be looking at medication? Should I be looking at different programs to address sort of a depression state? Or is this something that, I can sort of address on my own? And a lot of the times it comes down to, you've tried to address it on your own for a while and it's not working. It's not helping. And so that's when you sort of have to kind of take it to that next step and say, okay, I might be dealing with something a little bit more, intensive that needs a little bit more help.
When we are talking about that, when we've identified there's a problem, be it the depression or sadness, just being tired or actually being burned out or having compassion fatigue, what's the sort of the typical first step? Is it to remove the cause, to walk away from what's causing it, or to maybe try something else first?
I think the typical first step that I would recommend anyways is always looking at your self-care. Where's your self-care? Is it where it needs to be for the level of stress that you're experiencing? So that can be, am I getting enough nutrition? Am I getting enough physical exercise? Am I getting enough socialization and activation with my friends and family? Am I connecting enough with my spiritual self? If that's something that, you find helpful, where are all of those things? And so I think that's where you'd start and really start to look at, maybe I need to, I've been really busy. I haven't had time to kind of sit down and eat a balanced dinner or a balanced meal. I'm just, grabbing whatever. And everything sort of plays into each other when we're talking about how you feel. So your physical self, your emotional self, your mental health, your spirituality, they are all individual aspects of who you are. However, they're going to impact how you feel, each in their own way, that can also bleed into each other. So looking at those things separately is helpful, just to see, maybe I'm lacking in one of these areas, whether it's, I haven't been taking my medication properly, or I haven't been getting enough sleep. I've been going to bed really late. I've been getting up early. So I'm just physically tired. So I'd say the first step is to look at those areas.
Well, and that all sounds very much like what you tell me to think about constantly, sometimes with love, sometimes with frustration, of insight. Uh-huh. into ourself and our behaviors. Yeah. How do you, is there a way to maybe define that? So it's, if you don't have someone who will roll their eyes and shake the room if you're not doing it, that you can maybe like write a little notes or an affirmation about insight. How do we suggest that as something to sort of be aware of?
I would say insight is being able to look at yourself objectively, right? And so being able to almost assess yourself as you would assess a friend or a loved one or, a peer, in being able to say, if this was my sister doing this, if this was my friend doing this, what would I think about that? And I think that's kind of a good place to start with regards to insight, is just sort of knowing yourself and knowing, that this is not necessarily something that I know is healthy for me. I'm pushing myself too hard, and knowing your limits, right? And listening to your body, listening to even just yourself when you feel stressed out, looking at where, sort of back chaining where that could have started, right? And that's where the objectivity, I should say, comes in, is that, you can look at it and say, okay, well, how have I been sleeping? How have I been eating? How have I been, able to connect with those around me that I normally feel comfortable connecting with? So I think insight is something that we all are constantly sort of working on, because it's so easy to get sort of lost in your own stuff, and not see the bigger picture, not see the forest for the trees. And it's taking that step back and looking at it sort of with fresh eyes, with objective eyes, and saying, okay, when I'm not sort of, overly involved in this, then what does it look like? And how can I start to fix it? So I think that's probably the easiest way to define it, I guess.
Well, I think that's quite a good definition, so to speak. It's very clear as to what we're looking at. And I know something for myself that you and I have talked about, and I'm actually going to be writing about this week a bit, is keeping a routine, staying active every day. It's one of my goals and all of that. And I very quickly slide back into the bad behaviors. And that's where I need that ongoing insight to say, okay, I am now moving away from good behaviors and into bad behaviors, and I need to push myself back over.
Yeah, and I think...
Which isn't always easy.
No, for sure it's not easy, because, we all have those sort of compensatory behaviors, the things that just feel good and feel right. And in certain doses, those can be self-care, right? Like taking a minute to just sort of relax and maybe watch TV, or, taking a minute to just, relax and do something else. Or, in the right dose, self-care can be an unhealthy compensatory behavior. And that's why it's kind of difficult, right? Is that you almost, it's when you overdo it and it starts to bleed into you of avoiding doing other things, which is where, the physical activity comes in, right? Like, so, that's something that I just want to sort of shut down and I want to isolate right now. And sometimes that can be healthy, but sometimes that means that you're avoiding rather than recharging. And that's kind of where the insight comes in, is you have to look at, which one am I doing right now? And be honest with yourself, right? Like, and it's a process for everyone. I think there's no, just do this and you'll be fine and you'll be happy. And I think it just sort of has to be a balance for every person out there in terms of what works for you, what doesn't. For some people, running a marathon every week is, their self-care and is what keeps them grounded and keeps them healthy. And for me, that would be a strange and unusual torture. So I feel like it's sort of, you have to kind of know yourself and know what's healthy for you and what's not. And I think that routine is really helpful, just in terms of being able to sort of create that pattern of behavior.
Well, and that's something I did want to talk about, is creating the healthy patterns and everything. Sometimes when we talk about burnout, and for those who don't know, Kate has done multiple presentations on compassion fatigue specifically. And we talk about stepping away sometimes from the stressor, or finding a way to remove ourselves from it. So, I think the classic example of that is stop watching the news if it's upsetting you. Like, if it's causing that distress, then turn it off. But, in my life, being exposed to the news is part of the job. For you in healthcare, that's part of the job. For teachers, police, nurses, many, many people, what they do for a living, what they need to do, exposes them to these stressors. And then on the flip side of that, we also have the fact that today, more than ever, it's hard to get away from some of these things with social media. So you may want to get on, see what your friends are doing. You're pretty remarkable in that your social media is all cute dog stuff.
It's awesome.
Yeah, whereas mine is some cute dog stuff and a whole bunch of horrible stuff.
Cute dog stuff and puns. That's pretty much it.
Yeah, it's too many puns.
So many puns.
They're just not that punny.
Yes, they are.
Anyway.
Yes, they are.
This is an ongoing debate, and we will bring it up at another time. But what can we do when we are being exposed? Is this just maybe pushing health or self-care to new heights, or is it looking into other possible avenues of treatment?
Well, I think that you really need to know yourself and know your limit, and sort of play within it. And I know that that's sort of used over the top, but being able to know that this is what I find triggering and this is what I cannot stand. And yes, we are sort of bombarded with media, absolutely. But, we don't necessarily have to be. Using principles like mindfulness, like getting away, focusing on the present, focusing on your breath, mindfulness is sort of, all the rage right now, and there's a bunch of different apps that help you to kind of practice a bit of that meditation. And I know meditation is a bit of a scary word, but even just, very simple, very, taking a minute to take 3 deep breaths can be helpful and can be very mindful. And I think, when you say, how do we get away because we need to do it for, work or for, this or that, I think there's different ways where you can sort of alter it. And I always sort of challenge that, is that when you have something where, it's grating on your soul, I think you need to take steps regardless of what the consequences of those steps are, right? So, and they could be very drastic, they could be very small, they could be both, right? You could have somebody who, works in, and I've known people who work in dog rescue, who just get to the point where it's like, I cannot handle all of these sad stories, all of these, horrible cases of abuse that I see, and they get out of dog rescue. They stop doing it, right? Because for them, it was more unhealthy for their soul than it was helping the dogs. And so they found that balance just didn't work. And so for a lot of people, it might be just, there's some thing on Facebook where you can turn off videos playing automatically. So if you have, people that are posting videos that are upsetting, maybe with animals in distress or whatever it may be, you can turn off that feature so that you're not seeing. If you know that you have to be connected with certain people, and I'm using Facebook because it's sort of the only social media that I use, so it's an easy one for me to speak to, but I don't know about others if there's elements of, control that you have there. But you can choose to not follow somebody who's, posting all sorts of, things that you don't want to see or things that you find upsetting. So it could just be a matter of altering your friends list, right? And it could be a matter of getting out of it altogether. But I think at the end of the day, you really have to just take stock in how you feel and where you are. And do you need to just take a step back? Like, do you need to say, okay, I can be on social media for, 1 to 2 hours a day and that's it. Outside of that, I get upset, I get distressed, I get, bombarded by ignorant comments and I get upset by those. And so I'm going to limit myself in terms of how much social media I'm sort of allowed, right? Because otherwise I have to protect my mental health. And it may be a matter of, leaving it alone for most days of the week and only going on Sunday or whatever it may be, right? So you have to kind of look at, how do I alter this so that I feel better about it and I'm not as stressed and I'm able to deal with that stress. And it's not a matter of, do this and it'll be better. It's try this. If it's not better, try something else. And if that's not better, try something else, right? So it's a constant trial and error of, because I'll have people say to me all the time, well, I tried that, it didn't work. And it says, okay, that's fine. That makes sense. It's not going to work for a lot of people, but it's the continuous trying, the continuous sort of thinking creatively and trying to, either put limits on or, could be only watch with somebody who's supportive and who knows that this is something that I find triggering. And so don't let me, go down that rabbit hole, whatever it may be. But I think it's sort of working around what your own personal limits are and respecting those limits.
I certainly know more and more people now of all age groups who are intentionally turning off social media. Either, like you said, sort of just checking in once or twice a week, or just completely walking away from it for a month because it's such a stress on them, on their minds. And I want to touch very briefly on something you said, talking about mindfulness. And I know this is a subject that is vast. And I am putting feelers out, trying to get different people to interview on the various aspects of it. But when I first started hearing about it, when you first started telling me about it, and I went, you don't know what you're talking about. And you know what you're talking about, as I find out every time.
Really?
Yes. Every time I think that, you know what you're talking about. So that's my attitude of, I just agree with you. It's easier for everybody. But
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. But mindfulness is something, it's very, very interesting. And at first it sounds like woo. It sounds like, put out the incense and sit cross-legged and get your little bowl or your little finger symbols. But it's actually, there's a lot more to it than that. And I know this is not a subject that you necessarily address a lot about, but could you summarize maybe, or just sort of give it that 2-minute intro into what is mindfulness and why isn't it, silly hippie stuff?
Well, I'm kind of a fan of silly hippie stuff, so maybe it is. I don't know. But I think that realistically, mindfulness, it's gaining ground because it's been proven. And that's when things really start to take off, is that, there have been elements of mindfulness that have been proven to be just as effective as pharmacological treatment for some elements of depression. And so when we see studies like that are coming out, it's like, whoa, there's something here. So mindfulness in and of itself is sort of the practice of being present and focusing on the present. And so that does sort of equal meditation quite a bit, but different types of meditation, sorry. It could be, doing a body scan. It could be doing even just mindful breathing, mindful eating. Sometimes people will, they find that it helps to ground them. For example, we've used a raisin before and said, had just given somebody a raisin and said, take note of how that raisin feels between your fingers, of how it smells. Can you hear anything when you squeeze it? And then when you bite into it, how does that feel? Is it squishy? How does it taste? So really going back to your 5 senses to be able to kind of ground yourself in the moment. So there's different types of mindfulness, but I think that's, when you look into it and you just sort of start, it can be something that you go, oh my gosh, that's so ridiculous. But you have to keep in mind it's a practice too, right? Because people will often try it the first time and say, well, that didn't work. Forget it. I don't want to sit here and breathe. That's stupid. So that usually means that you did too much too fast. So, you could even just take one mindful breath just to kind of see what it's like, and feel the air moving in through your nose, through your throat, follow it all the way down, and then all the way back up. I mean, it can be that simple and it can be that quick, right? And it's just sort of building from that. And again, I mean, this isn't my area of expertise, but it is becoming much more available and becoming much more gaining popularity as it's proving itself, providing results.
Well, and yeah, one of my favorite podcasts, Science Versus, just did an episode on mindfulness and meditation, and it's a wonderful show because they take some of these subjects and look at it without any kind of spin or political agenda. They just ask very straightforward questions about a topic and look what the facts present. And with the mindfulness and meditation, they said there is more than enough evidence to show it helps. It then becomes a question of, separating how much it's going to help which individuals and whether or not some of the sales pitches are perhaps a little too intense. But the one thing they did talk about, and this is talked about in every single blog, book, podcast, webinar, everything I have now seen just touching on mindfulness and meditation, is that it takes practice, exactly like you said. And I remember when I first started trying to use it, and I'm extraordinarily new to this still, but I wanted to do the body scans, which I use almost daily now during my workday. And I said, what about a 10-minute one? And you pretty much just laughed in my face, which hurt my feelings. I'll say it because you're not here right now. Yeah, but it's true though. Like the 3-minute body scan, I love doing those. And I've got the Calm app, which is free. It has free elements, and the stuff I use is free because I'm cheap. And it's a really wonderful way I have found to just sort of stop, remove stress, remove the anxiety, and most importantly, stop the cycle of anxiety. For me, that's the big thing. Is it does sort of stop your brain from spinning for a couple minutes, get a little bit of energy back, and move on. And as you said, there's so many different types. Some of them are extremely well studied and have been shown, as you said, to have the same influence as pharmacological intervention. And there's other types that have been barely looked at, but still have tons of anecdotal evidence. So it's definitely worth checking out. Now, there was a question we had on the Facebook page when I said we were going to do this episode, and someone asked, how do you build up energy once you've hit burnout? And I think that's a really good question because, again, from my personal experience, when I get out of my routine, the routine that keeps me going in a good way, it's very, very hard to get back into it. So what's the general advice you would give when you do hit burnout or when you hit that was JJ helping, when you hit the wall and you need to get back into it? How do you start that process?
Well, I think, again, it goes back to your self-care. It goes back to addressing, how well you're doing in all of those different areas in terms of your physical health, your emotional health, your mental health. So I think you're asking, so say you've identified that, yes, I'm experiencing burnout. You step back, you do all those things, and now it's getting back into it. Is that sort of the question, or is it?
Well, I think it's very simply, one of the ways we talked about burnout right at the beginning was that you feel so tired, that you're out of energy, that you don't, like you can't find the gas to start. Yeah. So I think it's once you've taken the steps to maybe eliminate some of the stress or at least manage that stress, and now you've got to build up the energy to start the positive behaviors associated with getting out of a burnout feeling, as well as getting back into your life.
Okay.
So we could make up the example of a nurse who feels that they have burned out.
Right.
And they take some time off. So it's okay. You're getting back together with your mind. You're feeling better about yourself. And now I'm ready to get back to work. But you have to also get all of these good behaviors into a new routine. And you've got to get back to your day to day. So it's the amount of energy that's required to accomplish that feels monumental.
Well, and I think.
So how do we sort of activate?
Ideally, I think you do like sort of a gradual return to work, which many employers are utilizing, right? If somebody has been off on a leave. And I think that you need to really advocate for yourself with your employer to be able to do that so that, maybe you start one day a week, maybe one half day, and you start to sort of build up from there because it's just easier to sort of work that back into your routine rather than, you've got this nice healthy routine of, I get up and I exercise every morning and I do this and I do that. And then you go back to work full time and it's like, well, so much for that, right? And then you're back where you started. So I think really being able to respect yourself and being able to listen to yourself and know what you need to be healthy and what are the elements that need to be there for you to be healthy and to feel good, and really living by those, right? And not pushing yourself to ignore those things. So, gradual return back to work, and that could look different for different people. Maybe you find afternoons easier, so you start with an afternoon, right? Maybe it's just too much for you to kind of get up and get yourself going in the morning, right? And then sort of, you work on that gradually. Ideally, you really can't, it's hard to kind of, jump right back in with both feet. You really have to kind of, as you say, figure out how to do your work plus have these sort of healthy things that you've now learned that you need and put them in place and keep them in place. So what does that look like? And that does take some experimentation, right? So, maybe you try and work out in the morning and then you find, oh my gosh, I just cannot get up that early. So you have to kind of move it to the afternoon, and that's fine. So whatever works for you. And I say work out. To me, that's walking the dog. It can be getting outside for, 10 minutes of stretching. Whatever is sort of, helpful for you, just being a little bit physically active so you don't get those, that muscle tension and that stress that's on top of, right, the emotional stress. That's where we want to kind of avoid those trigger sessions. So it can be something very small, but it takes sort of a gradual return to be able to make sure that you've got those things in place. And whether it's, we use the example of the nurse returning to work, which, generally employers are good with, but if it's something like, being involved in, animal rights or animal rescue or, things like that, is you really almost have to work on your communication to your peers as well and say, for my own health, this is what I can handle and this is what I cannot right now, right? And be firm, right? Be your own advocate, and as strongly as we all advocate, for animals or for the people that are vulnerable, you have to sort of give yourself that same credit and really sort of protect your own health the way that you would protect an animal or protect somebody else. And so I think that's important too, is remembering that you need to kind of make yourself a priority if this is going to be something that you're able to put in place. So that's often communication, right? And being able to be assertive and say, this is my limit and this is what I'm going to stick with. And I'm sorry if that doesn't work, but this is what I have to do for my own health, and feel good about that.
In terms of asking for help, this is, I think, potentially one of the biggest problems that I have experienced, and I think some of the people I've spoken with have experienced, is knowing who to ask and what to say. Because I personally, and again, I have to stress this very much, in my experience, when you go into your general practitioner, your family doctor, and say, this is how I'm feeling, and they may, in one example I've had, they sort of jump the gun and say, oh, it's probably this, and move on. Or you go to, you go into a therapy office and say, I'm feeling this way, and this person, though, wants to address a certain problem. And throughout all of this, too, is the very simple fact that it's not easy to ask for help. And there's this stigma that's still around. And that's, something I think everyone is now familiar with what that term means. So how do we both, know who to ask and what to say to try and get that treatment we need and be our own advocate, as you've said? And how do we also approach that concept of stigma and not being afraid to say, I need help right now?
Well, I think knowing that, most agencies are bound by a strict confidentiality policy is helpful for people who are a little bit nervous about that stigma, about, what other people are going to think. That's something that, as someone who's worked in social agencies, I can tell you is sort of, absolutely one of the strongest priorities is maintaining that confidentiality, maintaining that privacy. And that's what helps get a lot of people in the door, is that is something that is guaranteed to them. And I think, depending on sort of where you feel like you need help, right? Is this something that, it could be a bunch of different things, right? Like it could be just simply, I can't manage my housework, right? I can't manage, how to sort of get all this done on top of all the other things that I'm doing. And so it's finding services, right? So it could be services to provide different things around the house, different things around your yard, whatever. But if it's sort of something that you're looking for counseling, you're looking for maybe some life coaching, maybe some support that way, and you're not sure, I think looking for, a lot of the times, I do recommend that people go to the GP because, if that's something that could be a depression, then that's where you want to start, is to look at, is this something that we need to look at from this lens or from that lens. And outside of that, whatever's sort of available in your area, there's always agencies for, to help people with addiction. There's usually family counseling agencies that are either public or they're available on a sliding scale. So I think it just sort of, it is a bit of you kind of have to take that deep breath and take that first step. And part of that is, going back to self-care again, is sort of giving yourself permission to ask for help, right? And acknowledging that. I often tell people, think about your best friend, your sister, someone that you really love and care for, and what would you tell them to do, right? And we often are not very nice to ourselves, and we're not nearly as forgiving and as compassionate with ourselves as we are with those around us, which is a little ironic, but I do find that to be very common. So I think that, having a bit of that conversation with yourself is that, if this were Polly, or if this were Anna, what would I tell her to do? What would I think that she would need? And to try and kind of frame it in that lens, which helps with the objectivity, which helps with the insight and all of those sorts of things. So I think that a good place to start would be sort of researching what's available in your area, and depending on, where you live, that's going to change. But also your family doctor is generally a good place to start. And if you go in and you don't feel like that was helpful, then trying something else, but always just sort of being willing to try, I think is the biggest obstacle. And that's sort of something that's personal that people can kind of work on.
To wrap up, I had some other brilliant questions, of course, but thank you for that. I could feel the eye roll.
I actually did not roll my eye.
Really? Because I'm pretty sure we could weaponize it and be rich. I'm just saying.
Cool.
Yeah. So now you've derailed me. Yes. So talking about going in to see your family doctor and this and that, and my own somewhat cynicism about my experiences with parts of the healthcare system. This is something you and I have actually talked about, is some people, and I think everybody knows somebody who is very much sort of against going to the doctor, or thinks that therapists want to trick them, or that there's some kind of plot almost going on. And I think you probably hit one of the most important parts with the confidentiality. And anyone who has been involved in therapy knows, like, it's very clearly spelled out in my experience, through group and through individual therapists, psychiatrists. Like, this is when I will be forced to communicate, but anything else is completely protected. And those reasons are pretty extreme too. So what else can we say to people? Because I feel I've known people, I'm willing to bet you've known people, probably some of the same people, who, if they gave it a chance to talk to someone, regardless of who the someone is, that they could see improvement in their day-to-day life. But there are these obstacles put up through, stereotypes that are inaccurate, or cultural expectations regarding sort of the therapeutic process in the medical profession. How do we get people over that hump and in to see people who really can help?
Well, I think that, just by putting it out there and by saying, being willing to try, I think that's part of it, is that, essentially people change when it becomes too uncomfortable to stay where they are, right? So we gotta have to weigh that for yourself. It's true. There's lots of people who are great doctors, and there's lots of doctors who aren't great. And there's lots of therapists that are fantastic, and there's some that aren't. It's like any profession out there, right? There's some plumbers that are amazing, and some that leave you with big leaks. It happens, right? So I think that realistically, it is about shopping too, right? And finding somebody that you really connect with. And if you don't, that's okay. Trying to find somebody you feel comfortable with, and knowing that, it's what's really helpful, and what I find really helpful about the therapeutic relationship is that person doesn't have another role in your life, right? When you look at going to therapy and speaking with someone, literally the only thing they're there for is to help you with that problem. They're not your mom, they're not your sister, they're not your spouse. There are no other elements of that relationship, right? So that's where, we can be, and if you want sort of counseling, that's where professionals are fantastic, because, it's hard to sort of, go to a counseling session and also talk about what groceries you need, right? So it's not having any other elements of relationship. It's just that. And then you walk out of there and you don't have to see that person, when you go home. You don't have to see them when you go to work. You don't have to see them when you get your gas. That's literally the only time that they are there. And that's a good thing. And I think that that's what, that often helps people once they sort of realize that, is that, okay, this person sees people all the time. This is what they do. This is their job. This is, it's okay, right? I'm not burdening this person, because I hear that a lot, right? Is that I just don't want to, I don't want to feel like a burden. I don't want to, maybe my problems aren't big enough, or they aren't bad enough to really necessitate. That's it. That's the word I was looking for. Necessitate seeking sort of professional help. And I think if you found that it could be helpful, then absolutely. It's not, there's not like sort of you have to be this bad to be able to access this. It is sort of more about, how you feel and helping you to feel the best way that you can. And I think, maybe if people are nervous about it, maybe there's some good online forums, right? In terms of people with depression, people with anxiety, even compassion fatigue and burnout. I'm sure it's out there, right? Like the World Wide Web is fabulous in some ways and terrible in others, but this is one of the ways that I think it is a good tool. Is that there's a lot of good websites, there's a lot of good resources online that you don't necessarily have to see anybody. You can sit in your underwear in your own home and read about all this stuff and sort of get a bit of an introduction to it. So if you're kind of nervous, you don't know, if that's something that you'd be into or if that would be helpful, and sometimes that can be a good way to kind of get your feet wet.
I want to thank Kate for joining us on this episode and for putting up with me in this interview and at home. Please do reach out to a professional if you're feeling burned out, as a therapist of any kind can make a big difference in finding your way out of the dark. Remember to follow the Everyday Fray podcast on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for more about upcoming interviews, motivational quotes, and blogs as I explore mental health and related subjects. I'm Michael Howie, and thank you for listening to the Everyday Fray podcast. This is my journey, and it's far from over.